Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Deadpool. The character's been in the game for quite some time now, but has largely been irrelevant. When he first released, he was actually quite good in PvE because of his all defense down effect, stacking up to very high levels and applying to world bosses. However, with the introduction of World Boss Legend, the all defense down doesn't really play much of a factor there, and his PvE status fell off pretty significantly. The devs tried to reconcile this by giving Deadpool a bunch of different uniforms and upgrading him, even with the introduction of synergy uniforms, so players could choose whether they wanted to build him or have him excel in PvE or PvP. But again, with his all defense down not really applying in World Boss, he didn't have much value in PvE and didn't really serve much purpose in things like Alliance Battle. And in PvP, he just didn't really have enough of a push or tools in his kit to really make much of a splash in the current meta, so the character has largely just been left on the wayside. And even with the introduction of artifacts, he was given an artifact that didn't really help him much in PvP at all, let alone PvE. And worse yet, the artifact was called the Undying and came out a bit after Wolverine's artifact came out that gave him immortality and just made him a huge meta in PvP, whereas Deadpool was given this and was just basically left there to not do anything. Thankfully, the devs did address this with the latest update and completely changed Deadpool's status in the game, making him arguably top 5 in PvP now and actually quite usable in PvE modes, including things like Alliance Battle. One of the key factors for Deadpool's rise in PvP is that the devs actually addressed his artifact, again called the Undying, to actually now give him immortality similar to Wolverine, and it is the reason that he can be so effective in things like Timeline, Alliance Conquest, Otherworld Battle, and potentially Alliance Tournament depending on the ban lists. I do also have to mention that this is probably one of the best updates in the past year or two, specifically because they improved so many different things and made actual changes to things that people weren't happy about. Unfortunately, the change to Doom wasn't enough. I'm not even sure I can call it a buff since they only really tweaked one thing and it didn't really change Doom's overall status in the game. The devs really should consider adding more effects into his kit or buffing up numbers or hit counts, since he doesn't perform nearly as well as he should for his cost. He's already eclipsed by Deadpool, and it only took one update for that to happen. If he could be meta for longer than just a half update or a week, it would probably be good not only for the players but also for the devs to actually sell that epic quest. Otherwise, people just don't care for it at all. But outside that hiccup, I think that this is a great update, and there is a lot of testing to cover, including comparisons of different uniforms, his PvE performances, and various different CTPs, including Brilliance, and how they compare to one another in PvP. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the testing. For reference, all the testing that I did in PvE for the most part was without a damage proc. When I do use a damage proc, I'll mention it in the clip, but you can see that the first test that I did isn't actually with the latest uniforms, it's with his previous uniform, which I believe is a seasonal uniform, and you can see what I was talking about in the intro. The character just really isn't that great in PvE. I didn't use his leadership or supports, and on stage 24 of Null, he was able to complete the fight, but did so under 60 seconds. Most characters now can complete this with over a minute left, sometimes over a minute and 30, even 2 minutes, and for a seasonal uniform, taking pretty much a little over 50 seconds to complete this just shows you for a native tier 2 character with it is just not good. With the PvP version of the latest uniform, he's able to complete this stage about 30 seconds faster, hitting that kind of average completion time that I mentioned before, which is roughly around a minute and 30 seconds. That's kind of what you want to see. Again, this is for the PvP uniform, so I think that is actually acceptable for his clear time. I actually had to do this test again, this time using his leadership to see how much of a difference it made, since for the PvE version of the uniform I have to use his leadership to actually showcase the improvement that the PvE one has over the PvP uniform, considering that a lot of the value is encapsulated with his leadership. The 40% attack increase with his leadership actually didn't make much of a difference here and only really changed the clear time by roughly around 5 to 10 seconds. There is actually a significant difference with the PvE uniform, specifically if you use his leadership, since you gain that 40% increase to boss damage. And as you may or may not know, damage calculates differently from attack increase and is actually a lot more useful. And you can evidently see that in this clip. I was able to clear the same stage almost a minute faster. But from further testing that I do later on in the video, the improvement is roughly around anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute improvement. It just shows a minute improvement here because sometimes if you go faster, you can skip certain phases and the improvement might show bigger than it actually is. Keep in mind that this clip is showcasing that the PvE uniform is a decent upgrade from the PvP one. It's not showing that Deadpool is actually really good for PvE, since the test that I do normally for stage 24 isn't using leadership or supports. So even with the leadership in this clip, if he wasn't using it, he's probably more above average, but not significantly above average for PvE. If you want to use the character specifically for PvE, I'd probably still recommend a CTP of Rage. It makes his rotations easier. There are some slight delay cancels and ways that you can maximize his damage if you use a CTP of Rage, but you can also make something like a CTP of Energy or Destruction function if you time your procs properly and maybe possibly avoid some hits so that your proc doesn't misfire on these skills that you don't want. In typical fashion, the level 80 increase improved his clear time by roughly around a minute and 30 seconds. To better gauge his tier 4 upgrade, I had to go into some higher stages of World Boss Legend, so I went to a stage 79 of Gore. On this stage, he didn't really have access to supports, so I'm basically just using his leadership, and it actually shows a lot since I was almost able to complete this fight and was pretty much just left with 3 health bars when time ran out. Going to a slightly easier boss, and for the most part just using his leadership again, since the other supports don't really help him, I guess just the insight does, I was actually able to complete this fight this time and did so with around a minute and 20 seconds left. I knew that even with the addition of 2 supports, going up to a stage 39 of the Dark Phoenix fight wouldn't really be feasible for Deadpool, but I still wanted to see how he would do, and I basically got down to the last 16 health bars before time ran out. Deadpool's tier 4 upgrade is actually pretty significant for improving his performance not only in PvE, but PvP, as you'll soon see. It also provides him a very significant stat bump, increasing his physical attack by roughly around 23,000 and his HP by around close to 38,000, at least for my account. I'd say that the tier 4 skill is actually quite good. It aids him both in PvE and PvP. Not only increases his attack, but also more importantly his damage. Like I mentioned before, how significant damage is for improving overall PvE performance. But on top of that, it also increases his HP by around 50%, which does make a significant difference in PvP if he can activate it. And considering that he has immortality, it more than likely will activate. In regards to his strikers for PvE, since he's order tagged, you can use Thor and is likely one of the best options for PvE, and for PvP, you have access to one of the best PvP strikers, which is Wolverine. With that tier 4 upgrade, I was able to hit that same 3 health bar mark about 2 minutes faster than before, and then 10 seconds later was able to complete the fight entirely with around a minute and 50 seconds remaining. I saw somewhat the same level of improvement versus the Ultron stage, completing it about a minute and 40 seconds faster. And versus Jean, because I could go through her phases faster, I wasn't stuck in some of those time-wasting animations or sequences. I was able to reach that 16 health bar mark around 2 minutes and 40 seconds faster, and was then able to complete the fight entirely with around 50 seconds remaining. Just for testing purposes, I also ended up equipping a mighty CTP of Rage using his PvE uniform, and was able to take down stage 49 of Kang with around a minute and 30 seconds remaining. Deadpool isn't meta for ABX, there's just far too much competition and high scorers for the speed restriction, but he still does quite well and has all of the cancel effects for the various different seasons. I think he might actually be missing paralysis on the PvE version of the uniform, but if you can get the character to T4, then you can obviously make that up in the striker. Without a damage proc and using his PvP uniform, I was able to score almost 10 million, was only off by around 300,000. Surprisingly enough, the PvE uniform isn't drastically better than the PvP one in ABX specifically, even though it is in things like World Boss Legend and Giant Boss Raid. In ABX, the hit count is the thing that has more value in terms of how good the character does, and there isn't a very huge difference between the number of hits from the PvP uniform to the PvE one. You can see that my score only improved by 300,000, but I was able to get to 10 million with this uniform. So again, that suggests that the character is actually quite decent for ABX, regardless of the build that you use, but obviously more specifically if you use something like a CTP of Rage. The tier 4 is what makes the most significant difference, and you can see that for Deadpool it makes a massive difference in ABX, as I was almost able to score 4 million more than I previously did when the character was level 70. He can basically spam the tier 4 skill since you pretty much get it essentially almost every rotation, so you get that extra 40% increased damage, as well as spamming one of the best strikers, which is either Ghost Rider or Thor, to up your score even more from the increased hit count. I didn't really bother testing him in ABL since he doesn't satisfy any of the restrictions there besides the no restriction day, and for that you obviously have better options. Interestingly enough, the rotation is basically the same between the two uniforms. You can do a 2 cancel, 1 slight delay cancel about a half second for the animation to start into a 4, which you delay cancel after again about a half second, or again till the animation starts, and then you do a 3 cancel 5, and when you have your ultimate you do the same thing, but you cancel the 5th skill and then go into your ultimate skill. When you have your tier 4 skill, you basically just spam that whenever it's available to get that extra damage and attack increase. You can see that even at level 70 without a damage proc, the character does quite well in Giant Boss Raid and is able to solo it within about 3 minutes and 30 seconds. In Giant Boss Raid specifically, the level 80 increase doesn't really do much for him, and he's able to finish the same stage about 15 seconds faster. The tier 4 is really where it's at, and you can see the massive improvement that it provides him since I'm able to clear the same fight pretty much 2 minutes faster than before. Just for testing purposes, I also did the same fight again, but this time using a mighty CTP of Rage, and it ended up shaving around 40 seconds from the fight. Although a lot of people are probably happy that Deadpool is actually usable and quite decent in PvE now, especially with his PvE uniform, I think a lot more are probably pretty excited to use him in PvP and have him excel there as a meta character, considering that you have access to the immortality effect now through his artifact, which I personally have a 5-star equipped on him and will probably upgrade to a 6-star after you see just how well he does in PvP. The first few tests I did with Deadpool actually didn't go that well, but I was using a CTP of Regen, which I previously had equipped on him at the time. I wouldn't really recommend people use this CTP if they have access to things like a CTP of Conquest, a CTP of Greed, or a CTP of Authority. It's absolutely essential that Deadpool has super guard break immunity if he's facing off versus meta characters, because if he gets locked down, he can't activate that second skill, which is absolutely essential for taking out opponents with big health pools because it is the main source of his damage. If you don't have access to a reforged CTP that gives you that super guard break immunity, so again that would be something like CTP of Conquest, Greed, Authority, or even Refinement, then the character won't really perform at a very high level because, like I mentioned, it's pivotal that he doesn't get guard broken or locked down permanently, otherwise he can't activate that second skill that is so key in his kit. You can see the significance of the super guard break immunity in this clip and the main difference between the mighty CTP of Regen in the previous clip and the mighty CTP of Conquest in this one. In the previous clip, Deadpool was only able to take out 1 life of Sentry and struggled heavily versus his second life, getting constantly guard broken or super guard broken, not being able to activate that second skill, whereas in this clip, he not only is able to take out both lives of Sentry, but also Silver Surfer, because he also gains that reflect immunity from the Conquest, and is actually able to just beat this entire fight completely. Keep in mind that Deadpool is level 80 during this testing, and he is still able to take out tier 4 characters like Sentry, which is essentially the #1 PvP character currently in the game, and even tier 4 characters like Silver Surfer. The fact that he can do this at level 80 while using his own leadership and just 2 health supports is a testament to how good the character's kit is, and that he is basically meta once you can get him to tier 4. His AI rotation doesn't really rotate through many of his skills, but for his current kit, it actually works quite well. He usually opens with the second skill, which is the counter, and even if it doesn't happen, so he does that iframe ignore, he still gets the 80% penetration from it. After that, he usually goes into the 5th skill, which is a full iframe and also gives him an attack increase. And oftentimes he will go into the 2nd skill with the 5th skill kind of still going, because the opponent can potentially interrupt him out of it. So he can basically layer those 2 skills on top of one another. And because he goes into the 2nd skill after being knocked out from the 5th skill, he basically goes into his counter portion of his attack, which is the 1-2 punch that usually takes out most characters. As you can see from this clip, he is able to take out a tier 4 Thanos as well, and even a tier 4 Adam Warlock. However, it's the 2nd life of Adam Warlock that proves to be tricky for him, since he doesn't really have enough of the stopping power at level 80 to basically box with Adam Warlock before the CC kicks in and basically locks him down and kills him. The other character that gives Deadpool issues, at least at level 80, is Wolverine, because he obviously has the type advantage versus him, and because they both have immortality. Wolverine can basically outlast Deadpool in terms of the damage and health that he has, and end up beating him. At tier 4 though, you'll notice that that isn't necessarily the case, and he does get a significant improvement the way that he does in PvE. Because of that significant attack and HP increase, he's able to be more tanky and is able to take out characters like Sentry a little bit more consistently. He doesn't have to fight him as long because that 2nd skill will deal enough damage, especially when the top proc of a CTP of Conquest is active to take him out. You also have access to the tier 4 skill, which actually fills up pretty quickly, and he can reach it pretty frequently because of his additional survival, and that adds another layer of not only survival, but attack and damage that will take out the opponent, including even ones that he has a type disadvantage versus, like Wolverine. And if you're in doubt and think that that was just a fluke performance versus a Wolverine, or potentially versus his new uniform that you might think is weaker, here is the same fight versus the old uniform. You can see that he is still able to take out Wolverine and win versus him despite the type disadvantage. So I mentioned previously that the AI focuses the 2nd skill, the iframe ignore counter, and then usually goes into the 5th skill, which is a full iframe. He doesn't really go into the 3rd skill, which provides him with damage accumulation, or the 5th skill that provides him with invincibility. And from this, you might notice an eerie similarity to Dr. Doom, which pretty much has the same fundamental kind of rotation and kit on his part. So you might be wondering, how is Deadpool meta over Dr. Doom when they pretty much have the same kind of kit and do the same kind of rotation? The main reason is Deadpool obviously has the immortality artifact, but on top of that, he also has passive healing, so he doesn't necessarily have to go into one skill or another to get that healing. He just has it all the time. And on top of that, the 2nd skill also provides him with damage immunity and super armor, so he is more likely to not get kind of guard broken or super guard broken and locked down, and actually have that iframe ignore counter skill activate. The other thing is that his 5th skill actually moves him around a lot and repositions him, which makes it very difficult for the opponent to potentially target him in that full iframe, or even have the iframe ignore counter trigger while he's kind of moving around all over the place. The other thing to keep in mind is that although that all defense down that ignores immunity doesn't have much use in PvE nowadays, specifically for World Boss Legend, it actually is starting to make an impact in PvP, considering that characters can stack up their defenses going up to tier 4, and that all defense down that ignores immunity going up to 80% on Deadpool's 5th skill and constantly reapplying it to the opponent really reduces their defenses and makes up for the fact that he doesn't go into his 3rd skill to get that damage accumulation. He gains that attack increase and applies the all defense down to the opponent to gain that offense increase and take out the opponent that way. The top proc or clash effect from the CTP of Conquest also synergizes very well with Deadpool, since he's constantly going into that 2nd skill, and it's very often that the top proc activates when he does the 2nd skill counter, usually coming off the 5th skill. And again, that with all those other factors is usually enough damage to take out the opponent in one shot of that skill activating. Furthermore, the immortality artifact coupled with that survival CTP ensures that he goes into his tier 4 more often, making him even more tanky and consistent, and giving him enough damage to even bypass some opponents that use supports, and giving him enough offensive capabilities despite the fact that he doesn't have a damage proc. For this reason, I would recommend a CTP of Conquest, and for all the tier 4 testing that I've done, I used the brilliant CTP of Conquest, so you can see just how effective that proved to be. Alternatively, you could also use a Steel Authority since he doesn't go into that 4th skill invincible often, so you could leverage that. You can also get that super guard break immunity as well as some additional damage from it, but it won't be nearly as good as the Conquest because most of his survival comes from his healing, and because the Steel proc won't really stack up to that 100% to give you that pseudo immortality effect on top of the actual immortality artifact. If you don't have these survival CTPs, you could potentially also try a CTP refinement to boost up his healing even more, but the potential issues with that is that you don't have base guard break immunity, and also that you don't get the offensive capabilities that the other 2 CTPs provide on top of the survival. The other CTP option to consider, and the one that I tested, was a brilliant CTP of Greed. I initially was going to use this CTP since I had more of it, and they work very well with characters that have the immortality effect, since you can burst down opponents very quickly, and in the old AC format you could actually just do that again while you still had your immortality. But in the new Alliance Conquest format, you don't really get that effect refreshing on the second fight, so it might actually leverage you more if you do play Alliance Conquest to make the character tanky, and also because I found him to be more consistent with the tanky build, whereas with the CTP of Greed, he seemed to get one shot more often, or at least have that artifact activate way more frequently and not really survive and solo full teams like he did with the brilliant CTP of Conquest. You can actually see the difference between the consistency and performance of the CTP of Conquest and the CTP of Greed pretty easily in these clips. All of these ones are with a brilliant CTP of Greed, whereas the ones before, the ones I mentioned, were with a brilliant Conquest. With the CTP of Greed, he ends up triggering the artifact pretty much every time that a meta character has an iframe ignore skill or an iframe ignore counter skill, and that means that if they can reach that death threshold from one activation, the next time it comes around, it basically just ends up killing the character. So unless he's able to activate the 5th skill or 2nd skill with that Greed proc up and able to one-shot the opponent, he's pretty much going to end up dying. The other reason that this build doesn't work nearly as effectively as it does for Wolverine is because Wolverine has direct iframe ignore, whereas Deadpool actually has to have the counter skill activate to deal most of that damage that allows for the one-shot. And if he doesn't have that activate, then the Greed proc is basically useless and doesn't provide him with much value, whereas with the Conquest, he's constantly getting value with his survival, and with the top proc constantly activating, he has more chance to actually do a very impactful and high damage second counter. That said, I'm not saying that the CTP of Greed is not a good option. I would say that it's probably number 2 after the CTP of Conquest. It just really comes down to preference and what your account is really built like. If you need more offense and you don't really have a lot of survival from your account stats and stuff, then a CTP of Greed would be more ideal. However, if you do have that survival already and you have a decent amount of offense, then a CTP of Greed will likely be a better or more appropriate option for you. If you want to know how to use the character on manual, it really comes down to the opponent you're facing. There is no really set way of using his skills, but the tips that I can give is to basically use the 4th skill and the 3rd skill. Just spam those so you can get the invincible and the damage accumulation from the 3rd skill, and for the most part just stick to the same skills that the AI does. Use the 5th skill to hide in your iframes, and after you see the opponent attack you, use your 2nd skill. Don't really use the 2nd skill preemptively, so if you're anticipating the opponent attacking you, because oftentimes you'll just be sitting there and you can just be super guard broken out of that skill. It's better to just stay in the 5th skill and then use the 2nd skill after you've kind of come out of the CC effects or the super guard break from the big attack that's already happening. So for example, if the Sentry does the 5th skill and you've done the 5th skill, when you get knocked out of the 5th skill and then are able to attack again, just use the 2nd skill and you should be able to take out the opponent. And obviously use the tier 4 skill whenever it's available. So you can see from the timeline testing that Deadpool is obviously meta for PvP. He's arguably in the top 5 spot, not only for timeline, but also all other PvP modes, including Alliance Conquest and Otherworld Battle, depending on the ban lists. You can see in this particular fight, even with Alliance Conquest changed so that the revive and immortality effect not carrying over to the second fight, he is and was able to take out Sentry, the top PvP meta in the game, as well as Dr. Doom, and had enough to be able to take out the Warriors of the Sky, including both lives. If that wasn't enough to convince you, here is another test versus Molecule Man and Wolverine, who, like I mentioned before, has a type advantage versus him and also has the immortality effect to go toe-to-toe with Deadpool. And Adam Warlock obviously doesn't help when two metas are attacking him, but despite the fact, I'm still able to take out both characters with just Deadpool. The funny thing is that I could probably form a stronger team than the one that I'm currently using. I'm basically leveraging the fact that Deadpool has a debuff leadership as well as an attack and defense increase to himself, and then I'm simply just adding 2 HP increase support characters, which actually synergize pretty well with Deadpool because I can increase his healing and overall survival and guarantee that he goes into that tier 4 skill more often, which not only increases again his survival even further, but also means that he can potentially wipe out the opponent, especially if you're using a strong striker like Wolverine. If you're wondering how to counter Deadpool, it seems like characters that have a lot of super guard break and potentially have a lot of CC and burst damage are his main counters, since he can't really go into that second skill often, or they can activate his artifact and then even reflect characters can clean him up. So opponents like Jean Grey, potentially with some strong meta burst characters, can potentially kill him. And the other one that I found, or the team that seemed to work well versus him, was that Carnage Silver Surfer set, since he has the weakness versus the reflect and Carnage has a type advantage versus him. If that still wasn't enough to convince you how good Deadpool is, even just by himself, here are some other results that I had from the defensive wins, just having the character set out there. I was able to get 5 defense wins in one phase of Alliance Conquest, and then in another one I was able to get up to 9 wins, and potentially even way more than that since the phase ended with the character still on the board. If you're wondering how the character fares in Alliance Tournament, where the HP stats and all those other effects are kind of amped up with higher multipliers, here he is versus a Sentry, Silver Surfer, and Adam Warlock. And as you can see from the clip, he didn't even drop to half health, let alone activate his artifact. His usage in Otherworld Battle will really depend on the ban list there, but on certain weeks, like this one for example, where most of the metas are now banned and mutant hero characters have a damage increase, he is actually quite good there, and if you use him potentially in the opening slot, he will activate his tier 4 skill pretty often and take out most of the opponents there if you have a good striker, and potentially survive even longer. You can also use him in the 3rd spot or just outside of the first 2 characters spawning, so that he immediately goes into his counter skill with damage already on the board, and potentially wipe out opponents that way too. You can see that in both instances of these fights, I had the character survive up to the end of the fight and pretty much ended up winning both. So that pretty much summarizes Deadpool. One of the things that I forgot to mention is that if you're using a CTP of Conquest, or if the opponent is using a CTP of Conquest build on Deadpool, one of the other ways that you could potentially beat him is just by having multiple supports on your team for high health and damage metas like Sentry, for example, or Wolverine. In those cases, Deadpool will struggle to be able to take them out if they have a type advantage or can lock him down, since he usually won't have enough damage to take them out when they're boosted up like that. As you can see, Deadpool is now finally redeemed, not only for PvE but PvP. That immortality artifact changed everything, and the latest uniforms give him enough of a buff, as well as the tier 4, to make him a top contender for PvP and a pretty strong character for PvE. If you're interested in PvP at all, I would highly recommend getting Deadpool for certain weeks in timeline when characters are banned. Characters like maybe Wolverine, Surfer, Thanos, or Adam Warlock. He can easily replace them in the top 3 for timeline, and is obviously a pretty big threat in Alliance Conquest, and fairly useful in Otherworld Battle for most weeks, depending again on the ban list there. If you're not really interested in PvP, then I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting Deadpool. He doesn't really stand out in PvE. He's just much better and actually usable now in PvE. And outside of that, if you haven't tier 4 Doom, then I would probably recommend focusing on Deadpool first. He is essentially a bigger threat than him now, which is kind of sad since Doom didn't really get his time to shine. He is arguably better now, but I still think he needs buffs. Regardless, you should definitely focus on Deadpool if you're interested in PvP whatsoever. In the next video, I'll take a look at the differences between Wolverine's old uniform compared to his new one, both in PvE and PvP, and I'll also cover some clips of how Dr. Doom performs now in PvP with his latest change. I put a lot of effort into this one, so if you did enjoy the video, found it entertaining or useful, please consider liking and subscribing, potentially even sharing it with others. Like I've mentioned before, it could help them out, and it definitely helps my channel grow so I can make more videos like this. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.